Have you ever really stopped to think about how a belief system gets built? It's not just a jumble of ideas, right? It has an architecture, a foundation, walls, a roof. But what happens if that foundation, the very thing everything rests on, has a massive crack in it? Well, today, we're going to dig into that exact problem by looking at two totally competing blueprints for belief. So, yeah, this is the big question, isn't it? How do you actually build a system of belief? Is it something you can put together piece by piece, like Legos? Or does it have to be a complete integrated whole right from the get-go? All right, so a really popular way to do it is to picture it like a three-story building. On the ground floor, you lay this foundation of reason, stuff you think pretty much everyone, believer or not, can agree on. Then, for the second floor, you bring in the authority of Scripture. And finally, on the top floor, you add your specific doctrines. But here's the thing. A theologian named Cornelius came along and said this whole piecemeal approach has a catastrophic flaw baked right into it. And that gets us right to the heart of the problem with this kind of stacked theology. It's kind of like trying to build a skyscraper using blueprints from three different architects who never even met each other. It's just not going to work. Van Til's critique was, well, it was pretty sharp. He basically said, you can't just take a foundation of natural theology, that is, ideas about God that you can supposedly figure out with human reason alone, and then just stack the unique claims of Christianity right on top. He argued the materials just don't mix. You think you're starting on neutral ground, but Van Til's big question is that ground really neutral at all? So this brings us to the core of the whole conflict. See, the argument isn't really about the fancy stuff on the top floors. It's all about the ground the building sits on. The entire disagreement boils down to two completely different, competing ideas about the foundation of knowledge itself. And boom, this is where the path splits in two. On one side, you've got the autonomy of reason. This is the idea that the human mind is the ultimate judge, a totally neutral and independent starting point for figuring out what's true. But on the other side, you have the primacy of revelation, the belief that God is the ultimate reality, and everything, including our own ability to reason, has to be understood by starting with Him. You just can't start in both places at once. They're mutually exclusive. Van Til just nails the modern mindset with this quote. The whole idea is that we, as humans, can figure out who we are on our own terms, and then we can decide if or how God fits into that picture we've created for ourselves. For Van Til, that's getting the entire process completely backward. Okay, so if the starting points are that different, what does that mean for common ground? I mean, what do believers and unbelievers actually share? Do they even know the same things? Now, according to Van Til, who's building on the ideas of John Calvin here, the answer is kind of surprising. Metaphysically, that is, in terms of what's actually real, they have everything in common. How? Because, he argues, every single person has an innate sense of deity. We all live in a world God created, and every single fact in this universe, from a blade of grass to a distant galaxy, points back to its creator. So, the raw data of reality, it's the same for everyone. The huge difference, then, isn't what you know, but what you do with what you know. The unbeliever, starting from that principle of their own autonomy, actively suppresses this built-in knowledge of God. It's not that they don't have the information, it's that they reinterpret every single piece of it through a lens where their own mind is the final judge, the ultimate authority. This whole situation creates a really fascinating tension. If everyone knows God deep down, but some are actively pushing that truth away, how does society even function? How can we cooperate at all? Well, this is where a concept called common grace comes into play. But is it a bridge that connects us, or is it the battlefield itself? Okay, first, let's get a quick definition on the table. Common grace is understood as God's goodness that's shown to all people, whether they believe or not. Think of it as the sun that shines and the rain that falls on everybody. It's separate from the specific saving grace that Christians believe is needed for salvation. Now, when we talk about what common grace actually does, there are two main views. The first sees it as creating a kind of neutral zone, a shared playground of facts and morals where everyone can get along and work together. But Van Til's view, it's completely different. He sees it as a divine restraint. Basically, God actively holding back the full chaotic consequences of sin in the world. This allows society to function, it allows for good things to happen, but it never ever creates a truly neutral space. So, you might be thinking, why does any of this abstract theology stuff matter? Well, the stakes are actually incredibly high.
This debate has massive implications for huge fields like science, and for the very idea of how we prove anything at all, including whether or not God exists. This table just lays it all out so clearly. You have the natural theology approach, the one Van Til is critiquing. Its goal is to persuade the autonomous mind by arguing from a supposedly shared neutral reason. But the best it can ever conclude is that a God probably exists. In stark contrast, Van Til's approach does the opposite. It doesn't try to persuade the autonomous mind, it challenges it. It argues from God's revelation to show that God certainly exists, and that, in fact, God is the necessary precondition for reason to even work in the first place.
Okay, but this raises a really obvious and fair question, right? If a non-believer's foundational principles are, from this point of view, totally wrong, how can they make these brilliant, incredible contributions to science, to art, to philosophy? Van Til's answer is fascinating. He says it's because they are still human beings made in God's image, and they're using the tools he gave them, like logic and observation. That common grace we talked about acts like a restraint, keeping their worldview from running to its logical and ultimately chaotic conclusion. So, a non-believing scientist makes amazing discoveries in spite of their core philosophy, not because of it. It's like they're borrowing intellectual capital, the very ideas of order, logic, and meaning from a Christian worldview, even while they deny the bank that issued it. And that brings us right back to where we started. For Van Til, it all comes down to this. A belief system, a worldview, cannot stand on two different contradictory foundations. You can't build a Christian house on a non-Christian foundation. You have to choose. The source material uses this really powerful short biblical quote to sum up the whole task. To be a witness isn't about entering a neutral debate club to argue that your position is more probable. It's about bearing witness to a reality, to a God who is self-attesting, whose existence is the foundation for everything else. Which leaves us with this one final, really challenging question to think about. If every atom in the universe is created and upheld by God, and if every one of us approaches reality with a fundamental starting point, either for God or for our own autonomy, then can any fact we observe ever be truly neutral? It's a question that rattles the very foundation of how we think we know what we know.